Okay. Welcome, everybody. A few news items while we're waiting for people to join us on YouTube. Thanks for joining us on this brisk February afternoon. Winter's making it clear that it's not in a hurry to leave, with one of the biggest snowstorms of the season taking aim at the region. Should make for some great snowshoeing this weekend. So check out the recreation section on the First Wilderness website for some ideas where to snowshoe. Some of our favorites in the First Wilderness are Dean Farm, Heritage Trails and Stony Creek, Hackensack Mountain and Warrensburg, the Lake Luzerne campground in Lake Luzerne, and Palmertown Trail in the town of Chester. So we have details about all of those on the First Wilderness website. One note is we do suggest being careful around frozen lakes and ponds because we've had some warm weather in the last few days and the ice is not as solid as it has been in weeks past. The other big story in the First Wilderness continues to be the ice jams on the Hudson River. So last week we told you about concerns about ice jam related flooding. The fears came true on Saturday when the Hudson River moved mountains of ice onto State Route 418 at the major Hudson River crossing between Warrensburg and Thurman. You can see a photo of that behind me, taken by Don Lehman. Look at all that ice and the 418 bridge in the background. So River Road in Thurman was closed by the ice, and highway crews are still working to remove the ice. This has been especially problematic for residents of the First Wilderness towns of Stony Creek and Thurman. They now have to drive an extra 10 miles out of their way to the north or south to cross the Hudson to get to work or to stores. The bridge closure is also a public safety issue because emergency service vehicles have to take these detours as well, which lengthens the response time. So we're hoping that the cold weather this weekend will slow the river flow and allow for the bridge to reopen. So we'll wait and see what happens with that. And it is now 2:30. So we welcome everybody to the Smarticus Story Collaborative. Through this series of civic conversations, we're working to build community development through heritage tourism in the First Wilderness of Western Warren County. Let's turn now to our next civic conversation, again, focusing on the Shaffers of Cabin Country. Last week, we talked with Dave Gibson, who's the managing partner of Adirondack Wild. This week, we're extending that thread and sitting down with his longtime friend and colleague, Ken Rimany. Ken was a close associate of Paul Shaffer for 10 years. As a staff member of the Association for the Protection of the Adirondacks, he co-led the association's first capital campaign. He also was the project leader overseeing the design and building of the Center for the Forest Preserve, now known as the Kelly Adirondack Center at Union College, which is Paul Shaffer's historic Homestead site. Ken's been a photographer since picking up his first camera at the age of 15, sharing many of his Adirondack and Catskill images with numerous organizations and civic causes. We've asked him to share several of his favorites in our conversation and tell us the stories behind them. You'll find more about the work of Adirondack Wild on its website at adirondackwild.org. As our co-host reporter for this story, we're delighted to welcome back May Broughton, a sophomore at Skidmore College who has an interest in environmental journalism. At the 45-minute mark, my colleagues Dan Forbush and Bill Walker will jump in with any additional questions that any of you in YouTube might post in the chat. So if you have a question for Ken, please feel free to write that in the chat. And we will now turn it over to you, May.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and many thanks for joining us. I'm really enjoying this tour of Adirondack history. So without further ado, I'll just run through the 9 questions we shared with you earlier. So to begin, by what route did you become a financial analyst with General Electric and ultimately meet Paul Shaffer in 1986? And how did your relationship with Paul initially develop and evolve over time?
Okay, thank you, May. It's nice to be here and to join this conversation. So how did this journey come about it happened over a 13-year period. It started back in 1973, right up through 1986. And it started when I finished graduate school and I was looking for my first job. And my brother, older brother, Ron, was an engineer at GE. I went through the technical marketing program. And he encouraged me to apply to the financial management program up here at Power Systems in Schenectady. He knew the gentleman who ran the program. And since I wasn't having great luck initially getting interviews and finding jobs, I said, sure. So I sent my brother my resume. He forwarded it on, and then I got a notice that they had an interest, and I came to Schenectady and I interviewed for this job. So the financial management program is a 2-year internship program in various different jobs for a few months each. And it gives you a chance to see the different operations, the accounting, financial routines, and then you get exposed to a lot of different GE managers. So as you come off the program, they get to know who you are as well. So that was the first leg in 1973. The second part was in 1979 when I met my wife, Nancy, and we got married. And the third part of this trip was in 1981 when we had our twin identical daughters, Jessica and Kristen. They're kind of key and critical because it brought Nancy's mom, Grandma Jenny, to Schenectady to come visit and see her first grandchildren. And on a subsequent visit, she visited a friend. His name was Dr. Herbert Strong, a lifetime friend of hers. And by this time, Nancy's mom and father were divorced. So Jenny went to see Dr. Strong, and apparently they hit it off well because they got married. Herb introduced me to his little cabin, seasonal cabin at Jenny Lake in the southern tier of the Adirondacks near Corinth. So then I go to 1985. So as I began to get different management jobs in GE, there's a certain level that you become invited to join an organization called the Elfin Society. It's a group of GE managers that go out into the community to develop programs with civic groups and to be an asset and do a bridge between GE and also those folks who live and benefit in our community. So fast forward to the Elfin Society, there are GE's power plant system had probably the largest collection of people here. When I first came to GE, there were 30,000 people here in the area. So there are 6 chapters. I was assigned to the Algonquin chapter. I put a host of different programs on, and then I found out that there's an annual recognition dinner for the new Elfin, persons like myself just coming on, the regular Elfin, people who are now in after the first year, and then seniors who are retirees. And it turns out that first year I won our chapter recognition as new Elfin. At the dinner, I found out that I was voted as the person who received the Schenectady Region New Elfin Award. And then my nomination went into the national competition, and apparently I won that too. So it was quite a ride. But the significance of that is one of the programs that I put on, I went back to Dr. Strong. Dr. Strong became world famous back in 1954. He was credited with the invention, the discovery of the man-made diamond, started the superabrasive business. And knowing that Herb had a camp in the Adirondacks, I was looking for a speaker to do something on the Adirondacks. I knew nothing about the Adirondacks. So he said without hesitation, there's only one person you talk to, and that's Paul Shaffer. And I went to meet Paul, we spoke, and he came out to the GE Research Center. The auditorium seats about 325 people, over 500 people showed up. I had no idea who this person was, but he had just come out with his new film, The Adirondacks, The Land Nobody Knows. It won the Cine Eagle Award. And after the presentation, he then began to give a small talk. And it was amazing. And the film was just incredible, and everybody enjoyed it. And at the end of the session, Paul said, I'd like to see you at my home tomorrow. So with that, I did go meet Paul. And it was at that time he was beginning to think about his future, his legacy. And I'll talk more about that next. But the idea is that when I spoke to him about it, he asked if I would consider helping him with this project of having his home as the new headquarters of the Association for the Protection of the Adirondacks, an organization I knew nothing about. When I began to hear more about the specifics, I told Paul, I said, I'd love to help you, but I don't think you need financial advice, at least not the type I can provide. And I think it's legal advice you need most. And then I departed and we reconnected 7 years later in 1993.
Great, thank you. So, very interesting to hear about your time at General Electric, obviously being successful with the Alphen Award and then coming into contact with Paul Shaffer and being introduced, to the Adirondacks. But what about before your introduction to Paul? Did you have any particular interest in wilderness conservation, and how did that develop?
I really didn't. I knew nothing about wilderness when I first got here. Lake George was wilderness to me. A number of my friends in the FMP program began to buy boats, and so we began to camp and go there. I did go once to Paradox Lake with another friend who was a fisherman. It was the Memorial Day weekend, and it turned out that the black flies showed up, and I never went back into the Adirondacks until later in June and July. So that was an eye-opener. But I got to meet Paul, Dave Gibson. And I guess that's the question. How did I meet Dave, and how did that all happen? And again, in 1993, I decided to resign from GE. After 20 years of service, the company had decreased from 30,000 people to almost 3,000 people. At that time, Jack Welch had come in. He was outsourcing. Businesses were leaving Schenectady. And with our twin daughters, I was working 2 jobs, initially replacing a financial analyst, and then another person retired, but that 2 job and partially just a temporary second job to cover lasted 5 years. So I was spending 60, 70 hours a week, and I thought it was time to do a career change and take some time off. And I did, and I got a severance package from GE. And I didn't have a specific plan, but I did want to take some time off. And the first thing I wanted to do was I wanted a good book to read. And I went to a local bookstore on Upper Union Street here in Schenectady. And as I came in, there was a line of people, and there was a gentleman sitting at this desk signing a book. And I realized this was Paul Shaffer. It was his second book called Cabin Country. And I stood in line like everybody else. And when I finally got to Paul, I reintroduced myself and asked if he remembered me. Well, his lights lit up, and he says, "Of course I remember you." I got my book, and he said, "I want to see you at my house this afternoon at 2:00. And I learned early on, when Paul asked you to do something, you did it. But it was joyful doing it. So I ended up going to Paul's home. I told him what had happened, that I had resigned, and that's when all the magic began to happen. So the next couple steps was meeting and going up to Cabin Country. Paul had macular degeneration of the eyes, hard of hearing. He wasn't driving much, but now that I was unemployed, I became his driver. So I, for the next 2.5 to 3 years, I spent almost every day with Paul Shaffer and getting to meet all these incredible people. But my first trip was up to Cabin Country. And that was what this book was all about. And that was the first time I got to see his wilderness cabin, which Dave Gibson is part owner of now. And when I first got there, we came in and we went up Edwards Hill Road. He stopped and we got out. He said, "I want you to take a look at this beaver pond and look at that beaver hut, look at the dam." And he began to tell me about all these glorious features about this little creature, which is our New York State animal. And by the time we got up to his cabin, there was a trough with a little tin cup. He grabbed the cup. This water was coming out of the stream. He took a drink and he lifted it up and he said, "Liquid gold." He loved his Adirondack water. And this wilderness camp, it was called the Beaver House. And this is a place that over the next 3 years, I would travel to meet incredible people like Howard Sonneiser's wife, Ed Sonneiser, Matthias, all of the children, grandchildren, and other friends of Paul, his hunting club. But magic began to happen, and I had the time of my life. While this was all happening, just about 1994, Paul had started an organization called Friends of the Forest Preserve going back to 1945. It was inactive for quite some time. By this time, Paul was a vice president of the Association for the Protection of the Adirondacks. But now that I was there and getting involved in some of Paul's projects, he got very excited. And he said, I want to dust off the covers of Friends of the Forest Preserve, and I want to reestablish it. And it just happened that this gentleman one day who lived in New York City, had a house a few houses away from Paul, stopped by, and Paul introduced me to him. And he started asking Paul, what was going on and what's happening. And Paul said, well, I'm trying to start up the Forest Preserve. And this gentleman asked a few more questions. And it finally came out that while Paul wanted to do all these different projects, this is an organization, obviously, that had been on the shelf for quite some time. And there were no funds at all to do any of these projects. So this gentleman said, Paul, look, I'd like to help you. He says, I have a letter from Jean Robert Forster that was written to Ezra Pounds, one of the 20th century's great poets, friend of James Joyce. And he said, I'd like to put that letter up to auction, and whatever it can get, I'd like to donate that to Friends of the Forest Preserve and start you folks off. Well, it turned out that that letter went off to auction, and it gathered $10,000. And Paul got the check, and now he needed a treasurer, a secretary to start the finances moving. So I was given that task, and that was my first job, opening up a checking account. And then Paul had a very close circle of friends. They were his best friends, his immediate circle, that took care of him, that Paul spent time with, and I began to meet them one by one. So Paul became, again, president. This was his organization, Friends of the Forest Preserve. Another very accomplished scientist, Dick Mesmer, became the vice president. And then one by one, the board members were assembled. And that's when I met Dave Gibson. So Dave Gibson showed up, again, not knowing who he is or even what this Association for Protection of the Adirondacks is. Dave is the executive director, and he's also part owner of the Beaver House. And then I got to meet Tom Cobb, who was director of the Minnewaska State Park, formerly with Saratoga State Park, another giant, and another co-owner of the Beaver House. And then there was Don Brightman, a GE retiree and engineer who had fought a lot of these battles and actually had done one of the sections of this magnificent map called the Adirondack map in Paul's historic room, the Adirondack Room. He was quite a storyteller and became a best friend. And there was Don Hall, who was another GE retiree and a member of Paul's hunting camp, the Cataract Club, which was one of the oldest hunting camps in the Siamese Ponds Wilderness. And then lastly, there were two other people, Dan Plumley, who to me was kind of like a Bob Marshall character. I heard a lot about him. And the very first time I met Dan, it was winter. You'll see a picture shortly of Paul walking out of his home. It was just about that time that Dan was coming back from Buryatia over in Russia, where he was working for George Davis and taking the principles of Article 14 and implementing them at Lake Baikal. Lake Baikal, if you look at the maps, it contains 20% of the fresh water of the world. It is enormous. So as he was going by me, I said, "Are you Dan Plumley?" He said, "I am." And I turned around, I went back in the house, and I listened to the story for hours. But Dan also was the first recipient of the Howard Sonneiser Award that was created. So Dan is quite an accomplished person, became a very dear friend of mine along with Dave. And then last, there was Noelle Riedinger Johnson, who edited all of Paul's books, and she joined the group also. And then I think that's basically how I met Dave, and that's how this all started. And then in 1994, I think Paul began to enjoy me way too much. And he said, I'm nominating you to become a trustee at the Association for the Protection of the Adirondacks. And mind you, all of these board members there that Dave was ED of are these enormous giants in kinds of conservation, enormous people. George Davis. Dave will remember some of these others, but anyways, the idea is I didn't know what I could offer to this organization, but as a photographer, I bonded with Paul on that. I had a love of the Adirondacks, and he saw something in me that I didn't see. And then in 1995, it turns out that the association wanted to expand its staff. There was Dave Gibson, the ED, and then Lydia Sorrell, a longtime employee of Paul's, who is now Dave's secretary and accountant. So they opened up a new job called the Director of Development and Outreach. So Paul encouraged me to go interview for it. And Dave Gibson called me up. I got the interview and I did get the job. And so here I am 27 years later, still working with Dave, different organization. We both worked at the Association for the Protection of the Adirondacks, and now we both work for Adirondack Wild Friends of the Forest Preserve.
Great, thank you so much. I hope this isn't too similar, but you did touch on this a little bit, but could you maybe just expand on how your work with Paul ultimately led in 1995 to, as you said, you're being named Director of Development, Outreach, and Operations for the Association for the Protection of the Adirondacks and Protect the Adirondacks?
Well, I came in. So one of the things, I probably have the simplest job description ever. When people ask me what I do, even though my title initially was Director of Development Outreach, I would say what I basically do is what Dave doesn't want to do. And that's been my support with Dave all these years. And it's worked out tremendously well. So I started off at the association, and then back in 2009, there was a merger of two groups, the association and then the Residents Committee to Protect the Adirondacks. The merger happened, and as most mergers do, there's a shortening of staff, and I was one of the first to be laid off. And I was, and unemployed for 3 months, didn't want to be there, but I was. And as I began to look and search for jobs, there was one thing that I really wanted to do, and that was I wanted to do what I was doing for 15 years with Dave and Dan. And I began to say to myself, what would Paul do if he were in my shoes? And so it was pretty simple and straightforward. I did exactly what Paul did. That is, when a cause came up, he would create a new organization. And at that point in time, I realized that I'm still the treasurer, secretary of Friends of the Forest Preserve. And Dave and Dan are both board members of the same organization. And so needing a job, I went back to our former chair at the association, Peter Brinkley. I called him up and I said, I have a thought. And he invited me to come see him. And I explained to him that I really wanted to work in this field still. And I said I missed working with Dave and Dan. And I asked if he might consider helping us getting the Friends of the Forest Preserve off the ground and getting Dan and Dave and myself to work as partners. And Peter was on board, and then the rest was history. We formed the organization in 2010. We're still going 12 years strong. Dan has gone off to become an independent consultant. Eventually, the Center for the Forest Preserve, that I'll talk about shortly, it was eventually sold by Protect the Adirondacks, the merged organization. They moved back up north, and the neat thing that happened out of this was the Center for the Forest Preserve that Dave and I worked on for 8 years of our lives, and we'll talk about this shortly. It finally was bought by Union College. Union College had given Paul an honorary doctorate degree back in 1979. The Adirondack Research Library, which was part of the association, was formed there. So there's a lot of connections, and we had a number of board members that were professors of Union College. So it was the perfect fit. It was nearby, and that marriage happened. And today, Union College is carrying on what we had all wanted right from the get-go, and it was to have this historic homestead preserved and saved, to have a permanent headquarters, a building with a research library with a special collections room, and to be a learning center. So that's where we ended up, and that's where we are today.
Yeah, that's really fantastic. Thank you. Just going back to Paul for a second, we know a lot about Paul Shaffer as an for wilderness, but we don't know as much about him as a builder, though we know he had a reputation for building high quality homes. So could you fill us in about that?
Sure. Dan, can you put that first photo up, Paul outside in the winter? Okay, so for the next couple questions that May's going to ask me, I think we'll just watch these photos because they speak volumes. As a photographer, going back from age 15, I consider myself a photojournalist. I've always had a camera in my hand, and I still do, but it's gotten a little smaller. I carry an iPhone now because it's more convenient. But anyways, so Paul also was a photographer and documented all of his historical happenings for many, many years, had thousands of pictures that he collected in his home. So Paul was born back in 1908, and he passed away in 1996. You're seeing Paul in the winter of 1995. I was picking him up to go out to lunch. And when I saw him walking out, something told me, I should be just shooting as many photos as I can of Paul. And I did photojournalize his life for 3.5 years. And what you see behind you is a typical kind of Paul Shaffer home with all the attributes that he had. But before I get into the special features of his homes and his personal home that you're looking at, Paul's profession was home building, but his passion was wilderness. And in 1998, Audubon magazine recognized the top 100 conservationists of the 20th century, and Paul Shaffer was among those distinguished individuals, along with his good friend, Howard Zahniser, who was the author of the 1964 Wilderness Act. Paul started off as an apprentice carpenter. He never completed high school, but he did receive an honorary doctorate degree from Union College in 1979 for his many years of work and achievements in conservation in the Adirondacks. And he gained his early experience as an apprentice carpenter working on historic restoration projects in the Schenectady Stockade. And then and that happened just before he started his first enterprise, and was called Historic Restoration Services. And it was formed more likely like an LLC. Paul's headquarters was most likely in his home at 897 St. David's Lane, Niskayuna, the home that you're looking at there. And his business was a small operation. He was the key person, obviously. Lydia Sorrell was his bookkeeper. I'm told that he had a main carpenter that he relied on heavily, and perhaps he had a couple small crews of workers, and when he needed to contract out for specialized help, he did it as needed. So Paul was not an architect, but he was an excellent draftsman. His drawings were works of art. And people who own Paul Shaffer homes tried to get copies of them. And they were just, again, works of art. But before any work was done, they were reviewed and approved by a certified licensed architect. Over his lifetime, when he was actively building homes, he built over 300 homes and restored over 200 other homes and buildings in the Adirondacks. So what are some of the typical features of a Paul Shaffer home? So you're looking at a similar type of home, Paul's, but he built in the Dutch style. Most were made out of brick with some wood, and very few were made of limestone, which is what you're looking at here. They came from the Helderbergs. And I have a few stories I'll end up with, but it's snow-clad above, but all of Paul's homes had slate roofs. He would not build a home unless it was slate roofed. You can see the multi-pane windows, which was a classic signature of all of Paul's homes, top and bottom. They could vary from 8 to 6 to 12, depending on the size. You can see a recessed doorway there in front of Paul's home. And that again was very common, and sometimes with a wooden beam overhead. Inside, you would have either pine or oak plank floors. The ceilings would typically have beams in them, many that came from crumbling Dutch barns. Fireplaces were very important. They all had fireplaces, and most in some of the house, I would say a lot of them had more than just one fireplace. Paul, in this home of his, he had 3. Wrought iron door handles and fixtures were common. Again, when Paul began his business, he wasn't wealthy. He was starting off. So Paul used to go and reclaim materials that were taken down by homes and other structures that had come down in the capital region. And he would reclaim cabinets and fireplace mantles. And they would come back and he would adorn a lot of the new homes that he was building. They were all custom made with custom features at the client's request. The one feature that I heard that was fairly small were his kitchens. A lot of women weren't happy with Paul, but apparently he sold a lot of houses. His personal home that you're looking at, the main structure in the middle, was completed in 1934 by Paul. He was just 26 years, so he probably started that when he was around 23 or 24 years old. And it was built on an acre and a half of land. It sits next to a 110 acre, it's called the H.G. Rice Bird Sanctuary, owned by the Hudson Bird Club, another nonprofit. And this home was built in 3 phases. You can see the original home in the middle. To the right of the doorway is a room with a fireplace with a cooking crane. And then to the left is the living room with like a little small dining room. In the back of the house was the kitchen. Upstairs to the right on the top was Paul Shaffer's bedroom. And to the left, you can see the small floor windows there just below the roof line was a second bedroom, and then there was a bathroom. So Paul had 4 children. So as the family grew, to the right of this structure, you're going to see what was called the North Annex. You would go from the living room down a staircase into the cellar, and you would get into that structure from inside that house. In that structure to the right, there was a main floor, and then where the roof is, there was actually a loft room. So that probably housed 2 of the kids. And then way to the left, when Paul began to fight the battles, he built what is now called the Adirondack Room, where he then built a 64-section to scale model of the Adirondack Park. So again, this is a very historic home. These were the quintessential trademarks or features of a Paul Shaffer home. A couple stories quickly. You're looking at the limestone there. All of that limestone came from the Helderbergs Mountains near Thatcher Park. And Paul had a pickup truck, and he would go over and ask either farmers or find on the roadside limestone. So you can imagine how many of these rocks and how many trips he must have made back and forth. And it was a good 30-mile, maybe plus 40-mile round trip for each of these occasions. On one occasion, Paul was coming back. He said that he got a flat tire. And the only way you can change a flat tire with all of those stones in the back is take them all out, change the tire, and put them back in. This was not easy, but Paul did it. All of these stones came from there, and that was kind of incredible. In the Adirondack Room to the left, there are 2. You can just see it above Paul's hat. It's like a dark feature, again, underneath the roof. And that is a huge, huge 30-foot beam. It's enormous. There are 2 of them, one in the front and one in the back. And the story with those two beams is that when he went with his pickup truck, you can imagine two of them on one truck. He probably should have gotten 4 flat tires. But as he started off, as luck would have it, and Paul did run into a lot of luck, he found 2 hitchhikers, and he was glad to give them a ride, but they had to balance these beams on his truck until they were delivered to his home. And then after they were taken off and brought to the site where he needed them, he drove these 2 hitchhikers to wherever they wanted to go. 2 stories on building homes. Paul met a banker whose wife wanted desperately to get a Paul Shaffer home. And so they began to talk it out. And as they got to some of the attributes of it, she said she just wanted pane windows on the top, but clear glass on the bottom. Again, if you're looking at this house, signature of Paul's homes, every single one, panes on the top, panes on the bottom. So Paul just said, well, that's not how I build my homes, and I can't do that. And so the banker looked at Paul. He says, you're telling me that my wife, we're going to pay you this money to build our home, but you want pane windows, my wife doesn't, and you don't want to do it. Paul said, that's right. This gentleman said, Paul, I admire your integrity and your values, but you're not going to get this job. And Paul walked away. And he had one other story about a very young couple who, again, very much wanted a Paul Shaffer house. And they came to speak to Paul. And again, they went through all of the criteria. And at the very end, they both looked at Paul and they said, Paul, we would love to have you move forward with this, but we just can't afford a slate roof. And Paul looked at him and he said, once again, he said, well, I'm sorry that you can't, but when you can, you come back and see me and we'll make your house. And as Paul told the story, the very next day, this young couple showed up at his doorstep and said, Paul, we can afford a slate roof. And that house was built.
Well, thank you so much. So on that broad topic of building, but shifting gears a little bit, Ken, you were the staff project leader overseeing the design and building of the Center for the Forest Preserve at the historic homestead of Paul Shaffer. So could you talk about that project for us?
Sure. I had no experience with any new construction. But one of my aspirations when I was a young kid was photography, woodworking, and oil painting. I did both of those, but not so much. While this is up on the screen, and I meant to tell you, Dan, to move to the second one, I'm sorry, but this is the historic Adirondack Room that I spoke about before with this enormous fireplace. There's a cooking crane inside it. And to the left of that is this enormous relief map that took 9 years to do with 50 volunteers. It was replicated up at the Adirondack Museum. Paul allowed them to take the plaster castings. They did it so there are 2 of these maps, but the original is here in Paul's home. Dan, if you can go to the next one, please. So this is the Center for the Forest Preserve, and this is what Dave and I have spent 8 years of our lives putting this whole thing together, the concept, and I'll talk more about it. But this is an overview. So I'll start off with there was an intersection of 2 things that were going on at the same time, and they were kind of like on a collision course. And one was Paul, as he was getting older, he was beginning to worry about his legacy, and more importantly, who would own his house eventually, and where would his collections go? And having been a vice president for 50 years with the association, he knew that his library really needed to be part of the Adirondack Library collection. And since the association in its almost 100 years had never had a permanent home, when I began to work for Dave, where we worked was at the basement of a dental lab in Schenectady. Didn't have any humidity or temperature controlled features in it. So the library that was there, the ARL, was not really being protected very well. So like Paul, when we began this idea of trying to start off a capital campaign, there was dialogue going back and forth from 1986 through 1995. And apparently there were a number of issues of which I'm not privy to. Dave can talk to us about that a little later. But suffice to say that a year after I got my job working with Dave, Paul died. And he went in for knee surgery, and a week later, he was no longer with us. And that was pretty sad. And a lot of us still had questions to ask and stories to hear. But the thing that was key and critical now is that Paul's home, something would have to be done with it. And so again, I was brought into the association to help raise funding, get new members, and do some of the outreach. So there was a lot of conflict, I'm going to guess at, and Dave again can speak to this, but there wasn't much money to buy Paul's home. And so there began to be a dialogue. And so in 1997, because something really had to be done, a decision had to be made about whether the association would either consider or not consider this historic site of Paul's, his home. We had a meeting up in Elizabethtown at Dick Lawrence's former home, his home, that was called the Hand House. And Tom Cobb was our president, presided. Invited was Barbara Glazer and George Davis and others. And you could feel the tension in the room. But at the end, both George Davis and Barbara Glazer spoke up and said this really was necessary. It really needed to be done. Again, for a lot of historic reasons, and especially Barbara, who said that Paul's home personified the mission of the association. And a vote came to be that day, and it was voted in a positive direction. There were people who actually abstained from it, and there were some no votes. But the idea was to go ahead, and so we began to do a feasibility study. But eventually, the house was purchased in 1998 by the Shaffer family. They gave us a bargain sale for the home, which was absolutely terrific. Mind you, if you own a Paul Shaffer home, it's worth anywhere from $50,000 to $100,000 more. And to own Paul's home, and he had cash offers from baseball players that used to come and play here in Albany. But Paul refused everything. Money was not the issue. For Paul, it was to preserve what he had built, the history behind it, the Adirondack Room, and his own personal collection of maps, books, and other collectibles. So a friend of mine worked with my wife, Nancy, was a real estate lawyer. We brought him on our board. He did all of this work to close out the house because as that happened in 1998, we began to do feasibility studies, ended up hiring Argus Architects, Janet Null out of Troy. She had done some historic work at the Great Camp. She was one of the very few architects that came in and started saying we need to be green, and proposed the idea of having a geothermal heating and cooling system at this facility. That got our attention. We ended up with Plank Construction Services out of Schenectady. We had brought on a person who I knew, Dr. Briggs McAndrews, superintendent of schools here in Niskayuna, and since part of our educational objectives, you can see them on the screen, was to have young people from K through 12 and college students come to the center. And that was key. So we brought Briggs on our board. And when he began to see our plans, he asked Dave and me if we had a project manager. And we both looked at each other. We said, what's that? And he said, you're going to need one. He says, I have a friend. His name is Jim Blundell. He was responsible for many, many buildings that were built by the state in the Albany area. And he said, he's an expert. This is the guy you want. I met with Briggs on at another time, and Briggs asked me, he says, have you called Jim up yet? And of course I had not, but I immediately picked up the phone. We hired Jim. It was a $15,000 2-year contract. That contract was paid over 4 times over by the time we finished this project. So again, I said before, what Dave doesn't want to do, Ken does. And I loved this project. I loved it. Dave and I understood it in spades, and we knew what needed to be done. But I said I'd be glad to oversee and work with Jim Blundell, with our contractors, with our architect. And that was my indoctrination into overseeing a project. I was on site for 2 years every day. I photojournalized everything that happened there. And as this building began, then we started to put together a capital campaign. Peter Brinkley, without him as our president, I'm not sure that this project would ever have been successful. He was brilliant, a former executive at Chase Bank. But he saw this immediately and said, this again is going to happen. So he gave us a lot of confidence. Barbara Glazer, who came to that historic meeting where she spoke and said this was your mission, she became one of our co-chairs. Barbara was the owner of Camp Uncas. She also helped the great Camp Sagamore get on its feet as an educational center, and Paul had helped her. Joan Davidson became another co-chair. She was the former commissioner of the New York State Parks Recreation of Historic Preservation. And Joan also owned a magnificent place in the Catskills called Midwood. And then lastly, Joe Martens, who was the former Secretary of Environment for Governor Mario Cuomo, then was the vice president of the Open Space Institute, became the third co-chair, if you will. So we had a very powerful team of very high-end chairs to take this on. So I had our first fundraiser, and it happened to be at Camp Topridge up at Upper St. Regis Lake. Camp Topridge is one of the most magnificent, large, probably the largest of all the great camps in the Adirondacks. It was once owned by Meriwether Post. And back in the 1960s, she was actually a member of the Association for the Protection of the Adirondacks. We had brought on a board member, her name was Ann Weld, who lived there. And so I asked Ann, I said, wouldn't it be great if we could host our first capital campaign at Camp Topridge? Well, that was kind of heady, but she did go to see Harlan Crow, the current owner, and made the proposal, and he let us do that. The one key thing that was very fundamental to me, and I never forgot it, was Clarence Petty, another legendary retired forest ranger who was in his mid-90s at this. He made a statement at this presentation as the guests from the lake had all come. And he began to say, I'm 90 years old, in my mid-90s. I've had a number of homes, but he said, here's one of the most magnificent conservation organizations in the state of New York. It's approaching its 100th birthday, and it still doesn't have a home. So we then kicked off a public campaign, and it was very successful. We raised over $1.8 million over the next 6 to 7 years. And then we began construction in 2003, and then ended and moved into this new facility in January 2005. So what we did was, in the back is a 4,500 foot facility. That's the new facility that was joined with that span coming into Paul's home in the back. And in there to the right, you can see the special collections room. Finally, it's sealed with temperature controls and humidity controls, and all these precious special documents are now protected. On the top floor of the building in the back is the administrative offices. Below it was the research library. And then in the parking lot, 8 wells were drilled in almost 200 to 300 feet down in the ground. And that was the beginning of our connecting to a geothermal heating system. And you can see Paul's home. Where the entranceway was, we added 2 water features. I drew these lines because I didn't have another type of drawing that would show them. But so that little squiggly line there is a main water feature. It was put there so that as people came, they would it would be like hearing a babbling brook, and that you were in the Adirondacks. The entranceway that you see going into the building, they're connecting to the connector. They were all steel beams and things, nondescript, as well as the door. And once again, we said this really needs to take on the character of the Adirondacks. So Ann Weld, again from Upper St. Regis Lake, introduced us to Jay Dawson, a rustic furniture maker. We designed a new wooden door with the help of Mike Triveria, a fantastic wood carver from Tupper Lake. The two of them built this magnificent door. One of the things I may not have mentioned earlier on, but one of my passions again are beavers, and so I had become to be known as the beaver guy. And so these artisans knew about that. And when the door got delivered, they were only commissioned to do the front of the door, but as we saw it when it arrived, on the back door is a full-size life beaver, and it was all done pro bono. So all of these artisans came forward. In the house itself, the bay window in the back was designed after Camp Happenstance, a bay window there, and Welds. You can go back one more, Dan, just for a second, please. And so again, a lot of these features came from great camps. Anyways, we can move on to the next one, Dan, if you'd like. You may. I think I've said enough on that.
Yeah, so the next question is touching on something you mentioned earlier, shifting gears a bit about your fascination with beavers. So is there a story here? Tell us especially about the story of your beaver gavel.
Okay, we'll run through this. So you're looking at a picture of Paul Shaffer giving Governor Mary Cuomo a beaver gavel. And this all happened in 1994. It was the centennial celebration of Forever Wild. So it was known by Dave Gibson that the governor was going to come to this event, which the association was sponsoring at the YMCA Silver Bay up at Lake George. And it was Governor Cuomo who was coming there very specially to give Paul Shaffer the Governor's Environmental Achievement Award for 1994. Nobody knew this except Dave and myself. And but Paul, who didn't understand any of this but knew the governor was coming, vintage Paul, he wanted to give the governor a gift. And with his love affair with beavers, he had a mountaineer that he wanted to build this beaver gavel, but this gentleman couldn't do it. And having an interest myself in doing these type of things, I said, Paul, I'm glad to do it. And so I did. So here we are. It's an October afternoon. Bob Bendick, the deputy commissioner at DEC, was giving a presentation, and this helicopter came flying in overhead. And all pandemonium broke out. Everybody was excited. Nobody knew why the governor was coming. And as he came in, it was my first meeting of Gary Randolph, another very famous Adirondack photographer. He sat to Paul's left. I sat to Paul's right. Paul wanted this event documented. So the governor, Dave introduced the governor. The governor came up on stage, began to talk, and then he began to talk about Paul's achievements and that he was going to present the governor to Paul this Environmental Achievement Award. At the end of his presentation, he invited Paul up on stage. And of course, Paul brought this beaver gavel that you see right there and gave it to the governor. He says, well, Governor, he says, an Adirondack beaver made this gavel with a woodpecker friend. And he gave it to the governor. And I think that's why the governor's smiling. And then as Paul got the Adirondack Achievement Award from the governor, he leaned over to Paul. He said, well, maybe a beaver could make the gift you gave to me, but only the gift that I'm giving to you can a governor make. Dan, if you can go to the next photo. And this was Governor Cuomo heading off on a helicopter. Robert McMartin had given the book that you see in the governor's hands. But the interesting thing in this photo that I took was that the governor did not give that beaver gavel to anybody. It was a gift given to him by Paul, and he took it. And anyways, that was the beginning of my making a number of beaver gavels for other occasions. Okay, Dan? So Dan, if you want to go to the next one. So I'm jumping ahead, May. I'm sorry. Did you want to?
Yeah, no, that's okay. It's perfect, actually, because the next question is about when and how your interest in photography began, and how you describe the work you've done in support of wilderness preservation, wild generally, and Adirondack wild specifically. And could you share some of your favorite photos and the stories behind them?
I'm going to answer all your questions with a series of photographs that I took, because each one has a story unto itself. The first one you're looking at is Lake Tier of the Clouds, and up on top is the backside of Mount Marcy. Paul Shaver, back in 1932, climbed up there with a camera that John Apperson had given to him to photograph forest fires that were occurring in that area. And on that separate day, that occasion, he happened to run across Bob Marshall and his guide, Herb Clark, and they exchanged words. And Paul told us of that story. It was incredible. I had never climbed a high peak, and I was on the Mohawk River with my wife, Nancy, and I said, I need to do this, and I'd like to commemorate this trip. So I did, and I brought two friends along with me, Doreen Dietz and Ralph May. She was a physician's assistant. He was a GE scientist, but also special forces when he was in the service. So they were my two guides. We ended up at South Meadows overnight in advance of this July 15th, 1995 trip going up to Mount Marcy. Paul said, you go up and you come back down. That's the shortest distance. But Paul had always talked about Verplaine Colvin, one of his favorite people. And he always talked about Lake Tyr. What you're looking at right there, he claimed, was the headwaters of the Hudson River. So on the eventful day, the 15th of July, 1995, at 5:30 in the morning, it sounded like dinosaurs and freight trains were coming up the valley. And that was the great blowdown of 1995. 5:30 in the morning, our tent was flat to the ground. We threw everything into a car, went to Lake Placid for cover. And I was disappointed that I couldn't do this, but my two friends said, why don't we just stay overnight? We'll go up the next day. And so we did. And as a photographer, I had 18 rolls of film. What I didn't know at the time was that my battery went dead. So Doreen lent me her camera. We got up to Mount Marcy up on top, and I was determined to come down and see this Lake Tyr of the Cloud. So this is the photograph I took of it to document it. But what my big surprise was when I went to my left of this picture for about another 50 yards, there was a 5-foot high by 30-foot long beaver dam. So when I came back home, saw Paul, he asked me to tell him the story. And I said, Paul, you're not going to believe this, but the beavers are holding back the headwaters of the Hudson River. He asked me if I took any pictures to document it. I said I did. He said, you're going to write your first history. He says, you've just discovered the highest beaver dam east of the Mississippi. So that's my story with this one. And Dan, the next picture. This is a very historic photo. It's the flowed lands to the left in the fog. I'm sorry about this. I couldn't find the original, but in the background, that's Colden, and to the right, Algonquin. To the right is Colden and Mount Marcy. And again, replicating a trip 50 years after this event had happened. Howard Zahniser, Paul's great friend, the author of the Wilderness Act, met Paul, knew nothing about the Adirondacks, wanted to help Paul fight some of these battles of the dams. Paul invited him to come to the Adirondacks. So in August 1945 or so, or 4, I can't remember, but the idea is he came up and they ended up at this particular place that you're looking at. And as they looked out there, Paul, talking about Article 14 in Forever Wild, Howard just looked at him. He says, well, what you have here with the constitutional protection for these forests and lands, he said, we need at a national level. So this is the genesis, actually, of where wilderness preservation began for the National Wilderness Act. It took 66 draft revisions and 18 years to get to the final version. Unfortunately, Howard died 4 months before it was signed into law in 1964 in September, but his wife Alice was there. This photograph eventually ended up in a photo contest at the old Art Center. It won first place in black and white. Nathan Farb gave me the award, and I got to meet Carl Heilman. So again, just as a photojournalist taking pictures, you never know where you're going with pictures that you take. So I was very fortunate. I went on this trip and took that picture. Okay, Dan. This is a picture, this won first place prize. It's just a landscape of a twig up at Blue Mountain Lake. And this all emanated from a lady I met, Nellie Staves, a very wonderful outdoors lady, known in the Adirondacks for her conservation work. She was a member of the New York State Conservation Council. but was one of the very few people who could call the governor and he would pick up the phone. But over the years, I got to be a very dear friend of hers and Dave too. And on one of my long trips up to Tupper Lake, it was a 3-hour drive coming back home. I was very tired and I decided to stop at Blue Mountain Lake at Potter's. And when I got down to the beach, I found this twig that you see in the water here. It's only about 18 inches away from the beachhead. And nothing was going on. And I took some pictures and started going back to my car, turned around, the sun began to set. And anyways, I stood there for actually, was on the ground for about 45 minutes taking photographs. But this was submitted to Adirondack Life and again, won first place prize. But again, being there at the right time, right place, I've never seen the Blue Mountain Lake this calm. Okay, Dan, next. So this, of all the photographs I've taken, this is my most historic photo. It's of Paul Shaffer. This is exactly 1 week before he went in for knee surgery, and then a week later he passed. So this is the Beaver House, the famous rocking chair that Paul would sit and others. So in essence, this was the last time Paul was in the Adirondacks. It's the last time he went to the Beaver House. It was the last time he wrote into the Beaver House log. And he wrote just 4 words, "Great to be here." And it was the last picture that was ever taken before Paul's death. And as I say, 1 week later, he was no longer with us. And that's all I have for now.
Well, thank you, Ken. Those are great photos. We have a couple of more questions. We've been going just about an hour. I don't want to miss these questions. You want to just comment on Paul Shaffer's legacy and the legacy of the Shaffer family?
I'll be very brief because I think it could be a whole session unto itself, Dan. But briefly, Paul had 4 children, and they were all incredibly accomplished. And in each way, they touched the Adirondacks. Mary Shaffer is the eldest of the 4. Was a theologian scholar. She lived in Halifax, Canada. She also was the owner of the castle in Keene Valley. And that was the first mountaineer shop that Paul's wife had opened up way back in the 70s. It was actually in the National Geographic magazine back in the day. But she was the proud owner of that. Again, traversed the High Peak area because that's where she lived during the summer when she could get some time off. Cub Shaffer, Paul's only son, was a home builder out in the Grand Tetons. So he moved west. He left the Adirondacks. He would come back and visit his dad, not often, but he was as big and as vibrant as you can imagine Shaffer would be. He was a big guy. I enjoyed his presence. I only met him twice, but what a joy to meet his kids. All of them were just, you know, you were in the presence of special people. Evelyn Green, who lives in North Creek, she is an expert botanist. She's a frazzle ice expert along the upper Hudson River and where the ice meadows are. And she has a fascination with liverworts and orchids. But again, her contributions are incredible up in the North Country. She lives in Warren County. So again, she is a featured speaker. I think you're going to be speaking to Evelyn, but you'll get to understand just how special this lady is. And then Paul's youngest daughter is Monica Wheatman. She lives out in Peonia, Colorado. Maybe Dave can talk about her a little later. I don't know too much. I've only met her once or twice. Probably my age, and just a delight. Again, when she would come, I've met her twice. Once when she visited her dad, and the second time when Paul passed away at his funeral. But all of these kids were just extraordinary people. And you know that you were going to hear stories, and they came out. We never thought that we were going to lose Paul so quickly. So I don't know that a lot of us transcribed a lot of these stories, but they were all precious. Vince and Carl were just enormous people again. Vince, my intersection with him was once or twice, but both brothers, and Vince was we'll say all of these boys, they never completed high school, but they were brilliant people. Paul had a photographic mind. Vince had an interest in chemistry, and he was a meteorologist, helped found the Atmospheric Science Research Center. He He worked for Irving Langmuir, who won a Nobel Prize as a physicist. Vince is credited with 14 patents out at the research center, and with a high school education. Not bad, is it? And Carl was he worked in the main plant. He was a stonemason, an expert. All of the homes that Paul had, all of the fireplaces were built by Carl. He had a shocking head of white hair. They all did. But again, when these folks walked into the room, you knew you were with a Shaffer. They filled up the room. One quick story about Paul, because he had macular degeneration eyes and couldn't travel, I had a lady who called just after Paul got his book, Cabin Country, and Paul couldn't get to the phone quick enough, and he asked me if I'd answer it, and I said, sure, and I did. And this lady said, look, I said, I just got this book, and I'm so fascinated. I want to meet this guy. Can I do that? And I asked Paul, and he said, sure, you can do that. So she came over, and so Dan, you've been to this house, and in the old picture you just showed just a few slides ago, that's what it looked like when you walked into this place. It was hot during the summer. There was no air conditioning. There was no air coming in this place. But I mean, you would just have beads of perspiration coming off you. But who cares? You're with Paul Shaffer. And I remember going in there and introduced this lady. Didn't know her. She became a very good friend of Evelyn Green's. And then Paul spent about an hour and a half. Paul would spend all the time in the world with anybody. It made no difference if you were a governor or just a person walking by. He loved people, and he could communicate at any level. But what was most impressive, when I was walking this lady out after we finished, she just looked at me. She says, Ken, I want to just thank you for this opportunity. She says, and I said, well, what did you think? She says, I think I just made Abraham Lincoln. But that's the effect he had on people, and the magic spell that he could put over you. So very special, but that's all I have to say about that right now. Dan, me.
Well, Dave Gibson is here. Dave, is there anything you'd like to add to that before we sign off? And by the way, I should mention, we're going to have Jim Shaffer with us next week. Again, it'll be on Thursday, 2:00 next week, but we'll be able to talk to Jim about his father, Vincent, and his uncle, Paul, and his other uncle, Carl. But Dave, any thoughts on what Ken said here?
Yes, I'm in awe of all that Ken remembers, and I have nothing to embellish it with, Dan. Maybe when we all sit down together up at camp. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for joining us. You had asked for an opportunity, Ken, to pass on one or two words of wisdom that Paul Shaffer gave to you, and then we'll wrap it up.
So a couple of them has to do with volunteers. And Paul would say to Dave and to me, if anybody comes up and wants to volunteer, there's only one thing you say to them, and that's yes. And he says, and then you figure it out later. And another one that he was famous for was no does not mean no. It means you just haven't found the right answer yet. And in other words, you need to stay in the fight to win the battle. Don't give up. My favorite quote from Paul was, you think you know, but you don't, but you will. And that happened when Paul was putting together a proposal. He would drive everybody crazy because he had all these brochures as they're all cataloged. He would pull photographs out, documents out. He would put a binder together that would be about 2 inches big, disrupting everything that was just done. And he did this about the purchase of the Finch Pine lands where the Blue Ledges were in the upper Hudson. And he had Don Brightman take this binder up to Bob Flack, who was then president of Finch Pine, former DEC commissioner. And I wasn't able to go with Don at the time, but I did know that, and Paul called me, says, well, Bob Flack came down. And he called me over, he said, come on over, I'll tell you all about it. I said, sure. So I went over. And so what I remember was going in, and I said, Paul, what happened? He says, well, it was a great meeting. And I said, well, what do you mean it was a great meeting? He said, what did he say? And he said, well, he said, nope, not going to do it. And I said, how is that great? He says, well, it may not happen now, but it will. And not too long after Paul died, Dave can talk more about this, about the Finch Pine deal. And Blue Ledges, the upper Hudson, all of that came into the state's possession. So Paul was a visionary. He saw things other people didn't see. He had patience. My most favorite phrase of Paul, there's just two more things, Dan. It's the very essence of what Paul fought for his whole life, and that was to pass on the legacy of Article 14 Forever Wild to the youth of distant tomorrows, so that they too can enjoy what we all have today. But that was the impetus of what he did and why he did it, always trying to preserve what we had for people in the future. And then my the most memorable reaction to a question that I once asked, and Dave reminded me of this the other day. So this has to do with those discs, Dan, that I taped over in 1995. That eventually, hopefully, we'll be able to get transcripts and share some of that with Paul's voice. But Dave reminded me that I asked a question, and it basically was this: if Plank Colvin, Bob Marshall, and John Apperson and Howard Zinders had got together, what would they be sharing with each other? What do you think, Dan?
That's a good question.
So Paul answered very quickly. He said, songs of wilderness from their hearts. And I'm going to end with that.
That's a great place to end it. Well, thanks so much.
Thank you, Dan.
So our next step here is we're going to take the audio. We're going to run it through Trent, produce a transcript. May will work on it. She'll work up a shorter version of this, about 2,000 words, and we'll be working with you on that, Ken. But thanks for all the detail about Paul's life, and that detail on the center that you provided is his building. That's very useful for us to have for our project, and we certainly appreciate your photographs as well. So Sarah, Bill, I think we'll sign off for now. May, thank you, and
Thank you, Mike. Thanks,
Okay.
Sarah. Thanks, Bill.
So much. That was
Join
great.
us for
Thanks for the
good
great
show.
stories, Ken. Really a good show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So long.